I'm very optimistic, actually. I think that there probably should be more practices opening up and things like that. But I would just hate to see you make the same mistakes as everybody else. Kick it.
Hello, welcome to Strata Stories. Today, Singh gives expert insight into the world of entrepreneurship, specifically talking to those who are considering creating a startup private practice. In this episode, Paul dives into funding strategies, options to mitigate risk, how to do market research, and how to balance passion, creativity, and profitability as a practice owner. Let's get started.
Okay, so you're a new grad, you want to start a practice, and you're trying to figure out where to get the money. There's a short answer and a complete answer. The short answer is that the fastest way as a new grad with no real track record to get any money is to turn around and look at your friends and family. And I hate to say it like this, but there's a reason they call that round the friends, family, and fools round. So with no track record, that's really your only choice. Now, to be clear, though, there are lots of different ways you can raise money, but they almost always require some amount of track record, maybe even some sort of collateral, depending on what kind of financing you get. But again, for most new grads, you've been in school for a while, you're just starting out. It's going to be your friends and family.
Wow. Okay. Is there anything super risky that they should avoid?
Let's start with the facts. The facts are that the majority of businesses fail right off the bat. Let's just start with that fact. Now, I don't say that to dissuade anybody from wanting to start their own business, but rather to start you out on sort of a sobering, with a sobering viewpoint. Now, once you have that viewpoint, you can kind of engineer your way around that. So when we think about things that they should avoid, like let's say you're a new grad, you're thinking about starting. Um, the reality is, if things feel overly complex, if you're trying to innovate in a business model or something like that, I would pause and I would really, really question your own assumptions there. Now, there's always this minuscule possibility that you're right, that maybe you're in an industry that requires some change or a location that requires some change. But the reality is that for most first-time business owners, what you really need to do is either fill a specific and well-defined need in your area, or potentially solve a specific pain point that customers of your competitors are having. Um, so I know this is probably counterintuitive advice, by the way, right? Because the question is very direct. It's what do we avoid? And I think the key here is to avoid failure. The goal really of starting a business should be to make it through your first year profitably. Even if the profits are little, you just got to make it through that first year. Um, there is this kind of awkward saying in the investor community that often the best entrepreneurs tend to kind of they tend to be kind of like cockroaches. They just never die. Um, that sounds horrible, by the way. There's this other investor I know pretty well, and he has a saying that I like better. He says that most early stage businesses are default dead, meaning they will fail. And it's the entrepreneur's job to really try to work as hard as they can that first year to make them default alive. So that's let me pause there because this is probably not where you wanted it to go. But
No, I like that. Let's keep going. So if you want them to start from the beginning and have a greater chance of success, do you think maybe don't think about a brick and mortar, maybe start with mobile to have lower overhead costs? Is that something you would recommend? Or
so the best entrepreneurs I know, the best ones that I've ever invested in, they despite what everybody says, right? Everybody wants to kind of point at entrepreneurs and talk about how risk tolerant they are. But counterintuitively, the best entrepreneurs tend to be risk averse. Now, that doesn't mean they take risks. It means that they take very, very, very controlled risks. Now, with that in mind, what I would say is that if you have a choice, if you're thinking about a practice and you specifically have a choice where you could choose between a brick and mortar location and maybe a mobile practice to start, that's an example of controlling your risk. I would certainly think about whether or not your model could work with the mobile version first, um, because the setup costs are a lot lower. Just to kind of use napkin numbers here, for example, most landlords that are going to lease some sort of office space to you, they're typically going to want at least a 3 or 4 year lease. Maybe you get lucky with a 1 year lease, but realistically, they're going to ask for 3 or 4 years of a lease. So now you've locked yourself into that, whether or not your business works or doesn't work. On top of that, you're it's probably this chicken and an egg thing where you need the location in order maybe for your various state and local licenses to get filed and things like that. So again, I'm not trying to dissuade anybody from a brick and mortar, but the way the question is asked, I would just point out that if you can be in a mobile setting to start, that is certainly a less risky bet because you could certainly start with the vehicle you may already have. You may be able to file some of the licenses at a home address that you already have. Um, and again, the way the question's asked, I would say that it's probably worth recognizing that your company's success is really not a function of what your overhead costs are going to be. It's really, can you get enough patients? Can you get those patients to talk about you to somebody else? So the faster you can get to that point, the faster you can start working on getting your company to be default alive. So if you can do mobile therapy, I would certainly do mobile therapy. Now, I'll say one other thing. There's probably a couple other ideas in the middle there. Maybe you could, instead of leasing a full brick and mortar yourself, maybe you could sublease. And again, I'm making this up. Don't like anybody watching this right now. Don't nail me on the in the comments here. But here's the thing. Maybe you're in a place where you could get a private office in a shared co-working space, and that's your landing pad. Maybe there's just again,
I have
I'm
I have
I,
heard that before, where some people might join a gym and then have a corner where they're doing physical therapy at like a CrossFit gym.
it surprises me that I don't hear more people talk about that option. By the way, because I mean, I was just at a conference a couple weeks ago, and there are large national, gym franchise chains that are actively looking for PTs, OTs to set up inside the gyms as standalone businesses, right? These gyms don't want to be in that business, but they also have empty, sub offices in there that they can rent out month to month and things like that. So there is a couple shades of gray between full standalone brick and mortar versus fully mobile practices. There's a lot of different shades in between there that are worth checking out. But I would definitely um, consider the idea that taking all the risks is not a great idea. You don't have to do that. The best founders tend to find a way to take very, very calculated risks.
There was something else you mentioned that I thought was interesting where you were talking about how you need to try to find a need that your competitors are not filling in a certain area. How does one go about that per like even coming up with that kind of research so you know what the gaps are?
Yeah, this is really fascinating. So I've talked about this before with other industries as well. Sometimes really fascinating companies emerge from customer complaints that are posted on things like Yelp, or Reddit or other online communities. So here's a good example. You might be a PT or an OT somewhere, and let's just say you look up 5 or 6 of your possible competitors on the Better Business Bureau and maybe Reddit and maybe Nextdoor. Like look them up wherever your parents or friends hang out, online, and see what people complain about. And often what you'll find is some common themes. It could be anything from, hey, these folks, they don't seem to care about me, or they might say those folks don't have online scheduling, or they might say, oh, their office is so dirty. I don't know. Again, I'm making this up. You're looking for patterns in this case. And now here's where the art comes into this. If you start to see those patterns, now the real art to this is deciding whether or not you can truly um, solve that, and whether or not there's enough complaints like that to justify solving it, right? Because sometimes there is a downside to this. Sometimes the only people that complain are the ones that you can never make happy anyway. It's a very uncomfortable thing to say out loud, but and that's where the art comes in. You've got to be able to look at this and say, yeah, that's a reasonable complaint versus, you know what, 99 people can't be wrong about X. Let's see if we can make that better. Um, so yeah, I would definitely look at online communities because customer complaints tend to give you the best view though. You just have to make sure you take it through the lens that, extremely happy people are less likely to leave comments. So you got to make that bet on whether or not this is a real thing or just a couple angry customers.
Gotcha. Okay, another question. How do you balance between your passion and gaps in the community as an entrepreneur? So, like, let's say you find in an area there's like no pediatric physical therapy, but maybe you're not really good with kids. And so, if you're trying to decide how do you balance as an entrepreneur, maybe gaps versus your passion, and what if they don't always coalesce?
If you're thinking about starting a practice, I would encourage you to leave any thoughts about what you're passionate about, leave them at home. And the reason for that is that the market doesn't matter whether you're in some rural county somewhere or some major metropolitan city. The reality is that the market doesn't care about your passions. Not because you're a horrible person, but rather they're consumed with their own things. They're thinking about picking up the kids at 3 p.m. and whether or not their car got broken into or whether or not and so you almost have to leave passion out the window, leave it at home, whatever. And I think the way to really think about it is what am I good at? What do I like to do? And what do enough other people want? The intersection of those three circles, that triple Venn diagram, the intersection of those three circles are, what you should really be paying attention to. Now, I also want to point out, by the way, I stole that idea from somebody. There's a really interesting book on this topic called "So Good They Can't Ignore You." And I think it's required reading for any aspirational entrepreneur because it talks about this concept at length. It's actually a pretty fun book. It talks about this concept at length that, that one of the biggest mental blocks for children, for adults, for entrepreneurs, for career, whatever, tends to be when they get passion mixed up in the middle of things. Um, One really basic example of this is that and I'll just use a sports analogy. There are probably a lot of people watching this that are passionate about football or golf or swimming or whatever, but they also recognize that maybe they're not ever going to be Olympic level. That's just it's too competitive. Maybe they don't have the biology or the physiology for it or whatever. The same is kind of similarly, I suppose, true for entrepreneurship. We can be passionate about this all you want, but the reality is if you're passionate about, I'm going to make this up. If you're passionate about, doing OT for knitters, that could be cool, could be really cool. Yeah, a lot of dexterity there, but I don't know that unless there's some true knitting capital of the world, there may not be enough, um, patience to help you
No,
stay.
funny enough, I listened to a guy on another podcast where he was really passionate about physical therapy for marching bands, and he literally created a marching band physical therapy program that he now sells to high school and collegiate level programs so they have the strength which is crazy.
Well, this is so now let's just use that example, by the way. There's a concept that we on the investor side talk a lot about called TAM. That's total addressable market. Um, Now, the way to think about this is that TAM, you don't have to own the entire addressable market. Like in this case, the idea that you could own 100% of knitters that need OT or PT, like you don't need to know that. What you need to know is can I get to 1% or 2% of them? Are they even near me? Like, can I get to them? Do they want this? Am I even interested in this? Right. Similarly, like when you think about that idea of somebody that created a PT program for high school bands. Well, on the one hand, I'm going to just napkin math this out. the addressable market technically is every high school in America with a band. We can go Google this, and I bet ChatGPT could tell us how many there are. Now the question is, let's say you're starting out. Well, the reality is, let's say you're starting out in the suburbs of Chicago. The number of high schools with bands in Spokane, Washington, is irrelevant because you're just now starting. So the question now becomes, how many of the high schools within maybe a 1 hour driving radius of me have bands? Can I get some percentage of them? Because if you can do that, that opens up a whole new set of possibilities for you. Which actually leads me to one other piece of advice I think most entrepreneurs, whether you're thinking about starting a practice or whatever, one piece of advice everybody should think about is, I think there's only two stages to any business. Whether you're an online business, brick and mortar, mobile therapy, doesn't matter. Here's the thing: there's only two stages. Will it work, and how big could it be? Most entrepreneurs, especially first timers, they immediately jump to how big it could be. They immediately jump to how big it could be. And I get why, right? It's fun and exciting to think about. Gosh, there's, I'm making this up, 20,000 bands in America that need PT. That is so fun to think about, when what really matters is will it work? Can you get three bands at three different high schools that you have no personal connection to? Can you get them to buy? If you can do that, that changes everything. Now, notice what I just said there. Three bands you don't know, that don't know each other. They have to be outside your sphere of influence, because people are going to tell you the stuff they want you to hear, right? You could, if you were in that high school band, of course the band director is going to want to take your call. Maybe that band director doesn't want to say no.
But I will appreciate the creativity that this business owner had, because no one's talking about, because band people typically aren't doing physical activity, like they're not being as athletic, so they're not thinking about PT the same way. But if you're lugging around a tuba, the amount of core strength needed, I mean, that's intense. And so you're targeting a demographic of people that don't view physical therapy like most orthopedic athletic types are. So they're
Yeah.
underserved, and then it grew to the point where, if you do something with the University of Alabama with their, I mean, you can write the check. So I'm like, how do you also be creative in a spot where, especially I feel like in the PT/OT industry, people are so negative right now. How do you stay creative and find something new that could be extremely profitable?
I think it's important to step outside of your industry. Let me say this a different way. Um, all of us, when we're going through school, it doesn't matter whether you're going, to become a PT or an electrical engineer, or, whatever, economist. By definition, you're training with people that want very similar things and very similar careers as you. So the first thing you could do, I think, and this is going to sound so counterintuitive, is change the friend circle. Now that doesn't mean like be horrible to the people that helped you get that's not what I'm implying. What I'm saying is that you have to like pick a different social scene to hang out in. Now that might mean that you go to like startup networking events. That might mean that you go to a different co-working space. Just change your environment, because the reality is that the people that have come up with you. Okay, so this is going to turn into a self-help thing for just a moment. I think everybody at some point in their life should move away from their comfort zone, like physically move away. Uh, you live in the suburbs, move to a city. You grew up rural, go somewhere. You grew up on the East Coast, go to the West Coast, and do this for like 6 months. Make it permanent if you want, but just do it for 6 months, because it forces you to actually then start to interact with new people, maybe have a different perspective on things, who probably have a different perspective on things, that think about industries a different way. Um, so this is counterintuitive advice, by the way, because nobody ever tells you this. But consider this. You know, doesn't matter. Like I think about this in my own life all the time. I grew up in a small town. My first job was at the local Papa John's pizza, making pizzas. Right. I still live here I'm 44 now. I've lived here my whole life within this like 5, 6 mile radius, minus like a 3 or 4 year period where I moved across the country for a couple of years. But to the people I grew up with, the people that I went to grade school with, the people I went to college with, I'm still the guy I was back then to them. So any notion of, hey, I want to start something new, or hey, I want to think differently, they're not trying to shoot me down, but they're mental models. It's really hard for somebody to view their friend as something different. And I know this sounds horrible, but the reality is the world wants you to be vanilla, right? The minute you step outside, I guarantee you, somebody listening to this right now, you've got an idea for a business. You're going to go to Thanksgiving dinner, or you're going to go to Easter dinner, whatever. You're going to sit down and you're going to say, hey, Uncle, Timmy, hey, Grandma Joan, hey, listen, I've got this idea. And 9 times out of 10, what they're going to say is, ooh, I don't know. I don't know. That sounds risky. I don't know. You've got this great job over here. Or look at so and so, whatever. They're not wrong, but it's hard for them to see you any other way. And certainly, who wants to see their own family member suffer? Because the first year or two of business always sucks anyway.
Which is
um,
which is funny because you were talking about how when you're starting a startup, your friends and family typically are the first source of funding. So how do you break that cycle? Because unfortunately,
well,
playing into
I,
each other.
yeah, this is a good question. I think just to finish that last thought off, I would say the world wants you to be vanilla, not because they want terrible things for you, but actually because they don't know anything different. They want you to be okay. You're their friend. You're their family, right? Um, so the world wants you to be vanilla, and here's the really disappointing part. The minute you accept and you become vanilla, the world disregards you entirely. Now, you bring up a really good point. How is it possible that I could say, you know, change your circle, but also say that the most likely source of capital for, especially for first time entrepreneurs or first time, graduates or whatever, is friends and family? I would say this requires you, the person, to really understand both sides of the dynamic and now take a very practical view, not a passionate view, not a romantic view, but a very practical view of whether or not you want to cross this boundary. So here's what I mean by that. Let's say that you have identified something that you're good at, that you like to do, and that maybe enough people in your area or your region or your market really want. um, Now, as you think about it, and you start to think about raising money, now what you've got to do is uh, approach the family and friends, but you've got to do it as if you don't know them, because these are the same people that, if you lose their money, you got to sit across the Thanksgiving table from them. You've got to walk across the street to take out the trash and see them every Tuesday morning. You've got to do these things. So I know I'm making this sound easy. It is not. My point is simply to say that you've got to navigate both sides of this, um, because it is difficult. It is really difficult, right? How do you go to Uncle Timmy and say, "Listen, I need $1 million to get started," and all the while knowing that there's a non-zero possibility that you will lose that $1 million from Uncle Timmy. So now let's tie all these topics together. Let's say you decided that it was mobile therapy as opposed to brick and mortar to start. Maybe you don't need 1 million to start. Maybe it's 50, right? Um, Maybe as you've done the research, you've started to realize that the that acquiring attention from patients is more difficult than anything else. Maybe that changes the way you think about your capital needs. Maybe you don't need the fancy sign out front or the fancy car. Maybe what you need is, a convert kit or Mailchimp account, and a social media handle and a nice camera. I don't know. I'm making this up completely, right? But my point is that you've got to be able to navigate both sides of this. You got to be practical about the business, but you also got to be practical about how you source that capital. Um, I will give you this one tip though, which could be an episode on its own. The best entrepreneurs, look, most people don't get finance training. I certainly didn't growing up. That's not my engineer. My undergrad was in computer science and electrical engineering. It has nothing to do with finance. But I am convinced, and one of the few things I tell every founder that I've ever invested in is, if you don't have to understand finance, but if you understand the basics of it, just the basics of it, then you are better equipped to really understand the practicalities of business, but also the sources of capital. Uh, Let me just give you one example. I know we're going a little bit long here, but let me give you an example. It's easy to look at, poor Uncle Timmy. I just made this person up, but poor Uncle Timmy or poor Grandma Joan, whatever. Let's just say, you need $1 million to get started. Well, uh, imagine this. You're coming at it. Most first time entrepreneurs are coming at it with a me attitude. They're thinking, "Gosh, I need this. If I could do this, I could then do that, right?" And because you got to be optimistic. I get it, right? But imagine Uncle Timmy and Grandma Joan. It's not like they're sitting on a nest egg of $1 million cash. They're probably not sitting with a couple Lambos in the driveway. That's probably their 401k. That's probably their stock investments. It could be anything like that. So you got to look at it practically and say like, well, let's assume that, a decent investment portfolio is going to return 8% year over year. That means that if they do nothing, they're going to double their money about every 7-ish years. So if you're going to go over there, and hopefully you listening to this are a good person and you're not really trying to swindle them out of it. If you're a good person, you're sitting there thinking, if they've got a low risk way to make double their money about every 8 7 8 years through index funds and things like that, what are you really doing that could potentially uh, increase that return over the same time period? And 9 times out of 10, when I ask people to answer this question, they can't explain it. If you can't explain it, you shouldn't be raising money.
Because it shows where your understanding of finance principles is, and that's the hard part with practice owners. Like, just go on YouTube maybe? How do you start learning basic finance principles so that you have a
Yeah.
better grasp of this? Because it's not
Well,
in school.
yeah, well, first of all, the good news of the internet is that it's out there. So you whether you so there's a couple ways to do this. If you like to read, like physical books, or even like Kindle, I think a decent book on this is uh, Brad Feld is the author, and the book is called Startup Deals, Startup something. Anyway, Brad Feld, Feld, has a good book on this, and it's a very lightweight read. You can read it, you can flip through it end to end over a cup of coffee and just get like the basics. Don't read every word, you won't understand it, but just skim it. You'll get a good picture of it. If you prefer videos, there's a ton of stuff on YouTube. I would specifically look at you know groups like 500 Startups or Y Combinator or TechStars. These are really reputable groups that talk about how to raise money and things like that. Um, if you prefer face to face, I would not go to your local startup event on this topic. I would really try to avoid that. Actually, even if you like face to face, it's really hard because typically the people that are willing to talk to you about this are probably not the most upstanding. I mean, the way to think about this is you kind of, if you need heart surgery, you want a busy heart surgeon. You don't want the one that's like free enough to take you 4 minutes after you called. um, so there's a ton of topics on this, but the thing I would just really impress upon you is that the basics of finance are very simple. You don't need to know what IRR means. You don't need to know the time value of money. You don't need to know all these things. Those are fancy things. Leave those to the MBAs because they're irrelevant right now. The way to think about it is that if you were to put $1 into an index fund like Vanguard, there's a term called Vanguard and Chill. Actually, it's kind of it's not something in the Webster dictionary. It's actually just kind of a term people use off the cuff, and really, it's called Vanguard and Chill. If you don't know what to do, take $100, go park it in a low cost ETF or index fund like Vanguard. They have tons of these VOO, VTX. I mean, there's just a million of them. And if you do nothing, these things effectively double your money every 6 or 7 years, maybe 8 years, something like that. And so as you start to think about that, it's like, this is really basic. It's like you got to return you for every dollar you put in, you got to grow or pay it back by about 8% every year. And I know that sounds difficult, by the way, but the more and more you think about that topic, um, the more you start to recognize that even as it applies back to your own business, the one you want to start, the goal is not to lose money for the first 4 years or something like that. You've really got to whittle down the idea, whittle it down as far as it can truthfully go, um, and still make money for you. Um, I think this is this is worth just talking about. I know this we're going long here. I have this I have a lot of research on this. I've personally invested in a little over 3,200 companies over the last 20 years now. And a couple years ago, my wife and I did we actually like brought on some independent analysts and had them do an analysis for us, and we asked them to give us a third party opinion on why companies fail. And it was really fascinating. What came back was kind of what our intuition kind of said, but now we had data to prove it. It is a fact that most businesses fail. Whether you're a truck or a tech startup, like most businesses fail. This is a fact. Uh, what's also a fact is most of them fail because they run out of money. What's not discussed is that if you were to now look at their Google calendars or whatever for the 60 to 90 days before they ultimately closed up shop, something interesting emerges. And it's visible right when you know what to look for. Once I tell you this, you probably can't unsee it. Uh, yeah, they all run out of money. They all fail, of course. That's horrible. But what's fascinating is that in the 60 to 90 days prior, a really fascinating phenomenon emerges. Uh, I'll use an exact. It's always you don't want to like share anybody's private info, but I'll give you an example. Let me use a tech entrepreneur as an example, and then we'll tie it to a brick and mortar. Um, Companies, let's say they have some piece of software, nobody's buying it. Um, in those final 60 to 90 days, what they do is they do this last ditch valiant effort to build more features. Because surely people weren't buying because the widget wasn't blue or because that login form looked weird. They just start writing code, right? And inevitably they still run out of money. So what's fascinating about this is that what they should have done at that point is stop building new things and sit there and call 200 people a day. They should have started trying to do more market validation, trying to get more customers, try to drive more awareness. But instead, they actually revert to what they, as technical founders, are the most comfortable with, which is code. Nobody talks like that, by the way. Nobody says this, right? They say, gosh, you ran out of money. That's so horrible. That's so sad. But if we look at core human psychology, we all do this. Even though we may not admit it to our friends or even ourselves, we all do this. When we feel pain, we often don't move to solve the pain. We actually seek to reduce the pain. This is a biological thing. It's a physiological response, right? So developer says, nobody's buying this. They don't say, gosh, let me go call 200 more people. Maybe the 5 people I talked to aren't enough. What they say is, well, what they do actually is they say, maybe it's because there's not enough features. So they do what's most comfortable. They build more features. Now, I'm going to bring this, if you're still with me, I'm going to bring this to physical therapy. The reason why most practices fail is because they run out of money. But why they run out of money is not because they got their license or their degree from one university versus another. That actually has no bearing on it at all. The difference between the ones that fail and the ones that don't is that the ones that fail tend to be overly romantic about the therapy. And instead of asking themselves, how do I actually make sure there's a steady stream of patients walking through that door. Because yeah, if you had good therapy, in theory, you would retain those patients. But if there's 1,000 patients driving by your location or whatever every day, and they don't even know you exist, you never even had a chance. And so where I'm going with this is, and I maybe I should just be very direct about it, is most physical therapy, and this applies to OT and speech too, most outpatient therapy practices fail because they fail to think as a customer acquisition company or a patient acquisition company. They're so focused on the healthcare side of it that they forgot to realize that if nobody's in there, you can't provide the healthcare anyway. Conversely, the best outpatient therapy practices can do both. They actively think about where their patients are coming from, probably more than anything else, but they also deliver great healthcare.
Boom. You make it sound so simple, so maybe we'll keep talking about this in the future about how do you do both at the same time. But that was just beautiful. I'm imaginary dropping a mic.
Well, I think I don't want anybody to think this stuff is simple by any means, right? Uh, but the reality is that the more complex something gets, the higher likelihood that it will stumble, that it will fail. Um, and I know that's hard to consider because you're watching Shark Tank and you hear these people talk about all these crazy things and it seems so complex. So surely you must do things that are complex. But again, I would encourage you to remember that like something that's made for television it's designed to strike a different nerve. And actually, if you really want to, like, back to your point about how are you supposed to learn about this, anybody watching this right now, go Google the outcomes of the majority of Shark Tank companies, by the way, now that we're talking about that. Yeah, there's a couple outliers, but the vast majority of them, even with funding, fail. And this is why I always think about this idea that even as an investor in all these companies, we don't change the outcome of the company at all. All we as investors do is accelerate the outcome that was already occurring, whether or not we recognized it. It's almost as if I was, my wife and I talk about this all the time. It's almost like we are just blindfolded uh, rocket engine fuelers. We're sitting there with the gas pump in the rocket. We're blindfolded. In our minds, we probably think that the rocket's pointed up, but it could be pointed sideways. It could be pointed down. And just to bring this all the way back to the beginning of this episode, the default state of every company is failure. And the only people that can control that outcome or even change that outcome is the entrepreneur in the seat or the team that's in the seat. And I think that's really important for for entrepreneurs listening to this is like my message is not pessimism, by the way. Like I'm very optimistic, actually. I think that there probably should be more practices opening up and things like that. But I would just hate to see you make the same mistakes as everybody else. And the good news is we have a large corpus of things to study from across the country that you can use to not make the same mistakes. Um, so anyway, let me pause there. That's probably more than you bargained for.
No, no, no. I love it. We'll keep it as there's no better time to start a business. You can be successful in your practice. You can be creative. Don't be vanilla, but know the principles. And we'll
I
just
like
start
it.
with that.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Strata Stories. Strata PT combines your EMR and billing into one automated system to increase revenue and achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate for physical, occupational, and speech therapy clinics. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and billing services work, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo.